I'm Rosa. I'm 41. And for 12 years, I was my mother's nurse while she died of Parkinson's. I changed her diapers, I administered her morphine, I slept on a mattress on her floor. And when she died, I discovered she'd left everything, the house, the savings, my grandmother's jewels, to my brother, a man who visited exactly 4 times in 12 years. But that isn't the worst part. The worst part is that I found the will she made before I moved in to care for her. In that will, everything was mine. And there was a letter, dated, explaining why she changed it. The reason made me burn the house down. I was 29 when my mother fell in the bathroom. I was a palliative care nurse at Memorial General, working the night shift, specializing in the art of making death comfortable. I had learned to read the signs of a body shutting down better than any machine. I knew the particular smell of liver failure, the gray tint of skin that meant kidneys were stopping, the Chain-Stokes breathing that came before the end. I had held the hands of strangers while they died, had whispered the words they needed to hear, had cleaned their bodies afterward with a gentleness that surprised even me. I was good at death. I was not good at life. I was married to Daniel, a paramedic with kind eyes and a patience that matched mine. We met in an emergency room at 3 a.m., both of us covered in someone else's blood, sharing a coffee machine that only dispensed black coffee because the creamer was empty. He asked me about the book I was reading, a paperback mystery, the spine cracked, the pages warped from being carried in scrub pockets. I told him the ending. He laughed, said I was terrible at suspense, and asked me to dinner anyway. We were trying to have children. We had a small apartment with a bedroom we called the nursery, even though it was still full of boxes. We had a shared calendar with ovulation dates marked in pink and hospital shifts in blue. We had a future that felt like something we were building, brick by careful brick. Daniel wanted 2 children, maybe 3. I wanted whatever he wanted, because I had spent so long giving other people what they needed that I had forgotten how to want things for myself. My mother, Elena, was 68. She'd been a piano teacher, the kind who wore silk scarves even to grocery stores and corrected your posture before you touched the keys. She had been beautiful in a sharp way, all angles and expectations. She had been widowed for 10 years, my father dying of a heart attack at 55 while mowing the lawn, a death so ordinary it felt like an insult to his complexity. Elena had never forgiven him for dying without drama. She had never approved of Daniel. A paramedic, she'd said when I told her. Not a doctor, not even a nurse, a paramedic. She'd said it the way she said everything about my choices, with a smile that made the words feel like medicine you were supposed to be grateful for. But if you're happy, dear, that's what matters, as long as you're happy. The emphasis on happy made it sound like a disease I hadn't yet contracted. The fall broke her hip. The surgery went well, but the Parkinson's they'd diagnosed 6 months earlier, the one she'd hidden from us, accelerated. She couldn't live alone. She needed constant care. She needed someone to turn her every 2 hours to prevent pressure sores. She needed someone to monitor her medications, to recognize the signs of aspiration pneumonia, to hold her hand while she hallucinated in the dark hours before dawn. My brother, Javier, offered money. He was a banker, married to Patricia, a woman who organized charity galas and spoke about the less fortunate with the careful distance of someone who had never been less fortunate. They had 2 children, Mateo and Lucas, who called Elena Abuela and saw her on Christmas and birthdays. Javier lived 3 hours away, in a house with a pool and a home theater and a guest room that had never been used. I can't disrupt the kids' lives, he said when we gathered in Elena's hospital room. Mateo's in soccer. Lucas has therapy for his anxiety, Patricia's planning the spring gala, but I can help financially. He sent $500 a month, it covered groceries. It didn't cover the nights. I was the nurse. I was the unmarried daughter. I was the one with more flexibility, even though I had a husband, a career, a life that I had built with difficulty and was just beginning to enjoy. I left my job at Memorial General. I left my apartment. I left Daniel, who gave me an ultimatum I couldn't accept. She has 6 months. The Parkinson's advances. You're abandoning our life for something that's already decided. I chose my mother. Daniel left. He didn't slam the door. He didn't shout. He packed his clothes, his books, the paramedic jacket I'd always loved, and he said, I love you. I have always loved you, but I can't watch you disappear into someone else's dying. He kissed my forehead. He walked out. I stood in the empty apartment for an hour, listening to the refrigerator hum, before I called the moving company. I moved into Elena's house on a Tuesday in March. The house smelled of lavender and old paper, of the perfume Elena had worn for 40 years, of something underneath that I would later identify as the particular scent of a body beginning to fail. I set up my mattress in the guest room, the one next to Elena's master bedroom, so I could hear her breathing through the wall. The first 6 months were manageable. Elena was angry, humiliated by her dependence, but still coherent. She could still walk to the bathroom with a walker, still feed herself with a spoon that shook but functioned, still play the piano for 10 minutes a day before her hands betrayed her. I administered her medications, I scheduled her doctor's appointments, I cooked meals that accommodated her swallowing difficulties. I called Daniel once a week, then once a month, then not at all. He sent a card on my 30th birthday. I threw it away unopened. Then I retrieved it from the trash, then I threw it away again. I never told Elena about the card. I never told anyone. The deterioration was gradual and then sudden, the way these things always are. At 9 months, Elena could no longer walk. At a year, she could no longer feed herself. At 18 months, her speech began to slur, to fragment, to dissolve into sounds that weren't words. At 2 years, she began to hallucinate. She saw my father in the corner of the room. She saw children who weren't there. She saw Javier, always Javier, standing in the doorway with flowers, with wine, with the smile she had never given me. The 12 years were a slow hell. I learned the particular rhythm of her body, the way her breathing changed before a fever, the way her skin temperature dropped before an infection took hold. I learned to change adult diapers with the efficiency of someone who had stopped feeling embarrassment. I learned to administer morphine in doses that eased pain without accelerating death, walking the line that palliative care nurses know intimately, the line between comfort and euthanasia that we pretend doesn't exist. I learned to sleep in fragments, 2 hours at a time, waking to turn her, check her oxygen saturation, to listen for the particular rattle that meant fluid was accumulating in her lungs. I developed insomnia that persisted even after she died. I still wake at 2 a.m., listening for a sound that isn't there, reaching for a medication tray that doesn't exist. Elena lost her speech, then her control, then her ability to recognize faces. But she never lost the ability to hurt me. Through screams in the night, through silences that lasted days, through the one phrase she repeated with perfect clarity even in the final stages, when everything else had dissolved into noise. You were never enough. She said it differently depending on the day. Sometimes with regret, sometimes with anger, sometimes with a clinical detachment that was worse than either. You were never enough, Rosa. You'll never be enough. No matter what you do, it won't be enough. I told myself it was the disease speaking. I told myself it was the Parkinson's destroying her filter, revealing thoughts that all mothers had but never voiced. I told myself this until I almost believed it. Javier visited 4 times in 12 years. He came on Elena's birthdays, alternating years, as if her survival were a celebration he could schedule. He brought flowers I threw away because she was allergic to lilies, and he always brought lilies. He brought wine I stored in a cabinet because she couldn't drink with her medications. He brought promises. Next time I'll stay longer. We should have you over for the holidays. The boys ask about Abuela all the time that he never kept. But Elena smiled when he entered. She smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years, a way that transformed her face from the mask of illness into something almost young. My son, she said, the words clear as a bell, even when she couldn't say my name without confusing me with the agency nurse who came Tuesdays and Fridays. My Javier, you came. I learned to hate that smile. I learned to hate it without admitting I was learning. I told myself it was exhaustion, the accumulated fatigue of 12 years without a full night's sleep. I told myself it was grief, premature, anticipatory, the mourning of someone who was still technically alive. I told myself that loving someone who couldn't love you back was a skill, like inserting a catheter, like calculating morphine doses, like positioning a body to prevent contractures. It was technique. It wasn't personal, but it was personal. Every time she looked past me to the door, expecting him, it was personal. Every time she accepted his absence with a forgiveness she never offered mine, it was personal. Every time she called me the nurse instead of my daughter, it was personal. Every time she thanked me with the same polite distance she used for the cleaning lady, it was personal. I slept on a mattress on her floor for the first 3 years. Then I moved to a hospital bed in the corner of her room because she began to need turning every hour, because I couldn't afford the time it took to walk from the guest room, because I wanted to be there when she stopped breathing. I woke every 2 hours to turn her, to check her oxygen, to listen to her breathing. I developed a permanent stoop from bending over her bed, from lifting her, from carrying her to the commode when she still had enough dignity to want the commode instead of the diaper. I stopped looking in mirrors because the woman I saw wasn't someone I recognized. She was tired. She was angry. She was someone who had given up a life for a death and who couldn't admit that the death was taking too long. I was 35, then 40, then 41. My hair grayed at the temples in a way that made me look older than Alina had at 50. I developed rosacea from stress, eczema from the constant hand-washing, a chronic cough from the mold I discovered in the bathroom but never had time to properly address. Javier's visits continued. He brought his children sometimes, 2 boys who called Alina abuela, and who sat awkwardly by her bed for 20 minutes before Patricia took them to get some air. I watched them from the doorway. I watched them have the childhood I was preventing myself from having. I watched them and I felt nothing, which was worse than feeling envy. Feeling nothing meant I'd stopped believing I deserved what they had. I had one friend, Marisol, a nurse I'd worked with at Memorial General. She visited twice in the first year, then stopped calling, then sent Christmas cards that I never answered. I couldn't explain what I was doing. I couldn't explain why I had chosen this. I couldn't explain that I was waiting for something, for gratitude, for acknowledgement, for a moment when Alina would look at me and see me instead of seeing through me that I knew would never come but couldn't stop hoping for. Daniel married someone else 2 years after he left. Her name was Jennifer. She was a physical therapist. They had 2 children, a girl and a boy, born 2 years apart. I saw the announcement in the hospital bulletin that still arrived at my old address, forwarded to Alina's house. I threw it away. Then I retrieved it from the trash. Then I threw it away again. I never told Alina. I never told anyone. The years accumulated like sediment, each layer compressing the one below until I couldn't remember who I had been before. I remembered being a nurse who loved her work, but I couldn't remember the feeling of satisfaction after a good death. I remembered being a wife who loved her husband, but I couldn't remember the texture of his skin or the sound of his voice. I remembered wanting children, but I couldn't remember what wanting felt like, whether it was sharp or soft or warm or cold. Alina's deterioration continued. She developed contractures in her hands, her fingers curling inward like claws. She developed dysphagia, her swallowing so impaired that I had to thicken her liquids to the consistency of honey. She developed dementia, the Parkinson's and the medications and the lack of stimulation combining to destroy what remained of her mind. She no longer knew my name. She no longer knew her own name. She was a body, a collection of failing systems, a death that took 12 years to complete. But she still smiled for Javier. Even in the final months when she no longer recognized me, when she screamed when I touched her, when she bit my hand when I tried to administer her medications, she still smiled when he entered the room. It was a reflex, I told myself, a conditioned response. The disease had destroyed everything else but had left this one pathway intact, this one connection between sun and joy. It wasn't personal. It wasn't about me. It was about me. It had always been about me. Alina died at 80. I was at her side, holding her hand, administering the final dose of morphine. The hospice doctor had left an hour before, having signed the forms that allowed me to increase the dosage to a level that would ease her into whatever came next. The agency nurse had gone home, her shift ended, her obligation fulfilled. It was just us, the way it had been for 12 years. Just me and her and the space between us that had never closed. Her last words weren't to me. They were to the empty space beside the bed, where Javier should have been, where he had never been, where he would never be. Finally, she murmured, her voice so faint I had to lean close to hear. Finally, peace. I didn't know if she meant death or me. I closed her eyes. I waited the required hour, sitting in the chair I'd spent 12 years occupying, listening to the silence that was different from the silence of her breathing. I called the funeral home. I called Javier. I called no one else. There was no one else. I had stopped having friends years ago. I had stopped having a life. I had stopped being someone who could be called in the middle of the night with news that wasn't about death. The funeral was brief. Javier cried, dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief that had been his father's, that Alina had kept in her jewelry box for 40 years. Patricia stood beside him, her hand on his arm, her face arranged in the expression of composed grief that she had perfected at charity events. Boys, now teenagers, stood awkwardly in suits they'd outgrown, checking their phones when they thought no one was looking. I didn't cry. I couldn't remember when I'd learned to contain tears, whether it was during Alina's first urinary tract infection or her second or her 10th. Whether it was during the night she screamed for 6 hours, hallucinating that my father was trying to kill her. Whether it was during the morning I found her covered in feces, having pulled out her catheter, having smeared the walls with her own waste. I had cried then, I thought. I must have cried then. But I couldn't remember the feeling, the release, the way tears had once made me feel lighter instead of heavier. I cried later, alone in her room, on the mattress that still smelled of disinfectant and old skin, and the particular lavender scent that Alina had worn until the end. I cried for 12 years, for the life I hadn't lived, for the children I hadn't had, for the husband who had loved me and left me because I couldn't love myself enough to choose him. I cried for the nurse I had been, the one who believed that care was a form of love, that presence was a form of meaning, that suffering had a purpose if it was endured with grace. I had been wrong. Suffering had no purpose. It was just suffering. And I had chosen it, day after day, year after year, because I had believed that choosing it would make me worthy of something. Of love, of respect, of a place in my mother's eyes that I had never occupied and would never occupy. The will reading was a week later. Javier was there, with Patricia, with his children. I was alone. I had thought about bringing someone, anyone, but there was no one. Marisol had stopped calling years ago. Daniel had a new life. My colleagues at Memorial General wouldn't recognize me now, wouldn't know what to say to this woman who had disappeared into someone else's dying. The lawyer was a man named Henderson, elderly, efficient, with the particular discomfort of someone who had read many wills and learned to distance himself from their contents. He read, the house valued at $340,000 to Javier. The savings account $78,000 to Javier. My grandmother's jewels, the ones Alina had inherited and never worn because they were too flashy, to Patricia. To me, my gratitude for her dedication. Nothing more, not a dollar, not an object, not a mention of 12 years. I didn't argue, I couldn't. I was in shock, the particular shock that comes not from surprise but from confirmation, from having known something deep down and refused to acknowledge it until it was spoken aloud. I had known. I had always known. The will was simply the document that made my knowledge official. I nodded. I signed where Henderson indicated. I shook Javier's hand, accepted his embrace, listened to his whispered, thank you for everything with the same polite distance I had learned from my mother. I walked out. I drove home. I sat in Alina's house, now Javier's house, and I waited for the feeling to come. It didn't. I spent 3 days cleaning. Not the kind of cleaning that prepares a house for sale, but the kind of cleaning that searches for something. I went through drawers I had never opened, boxes I had never moved, spaces that had been Alina's alone for the 12 years I had lived beside her without entering her private world. I found photographs of Javier as a child, hundreds of them, arranged in albums with careful handwriting. I found his report cards, his awards, his first bank account statement. I found a lock of his baby hair in a velvet box. I found nothing of mine. No photographs, no memorabilia, no evidence that I had existed before I became her nurse. I found her journals, 40 years of them, filled with observations about music, about students, about the weather. I found 3 mentions of me. Rosa started school today, cried at the door, needs to be stronger. Rosa failed her piano examination, not a musical temperament. Rosa married a paramedic, I suppose she's happy. 3 mentions in 40 years. Javier appeared on every 3rd page. I was preparing to stop, to accept that there was nothing more to find, when I moved the dresser in her bedroom. It was heavy, antique, the kind of furniture that had been in her family for generations. Behind it, caught between the wall and the floorboard, was a shoebox. Dusty, forgotten, hidden. Inside, a yellowed envelope, an earlier will and a handwritten letter. The earlier will was dated 12 years ago, 3 months before I moved in to care for her. It left everything to me. The house, the savings, the jewels. Because she has sacrificed her life for me, Alina wrote in her firm teacher's handwriting. Because she is the only one who stayed. Because she is the only one who ever loved me without requiring me to be grateful. I read it 3 times. Then I read the letter. It was dated a year later. Alina's handwriting had deteriorated, the Parkinson's already affecting her fine motor control. The letters trembled, some words illegible, the paper stained with what might have been medication or coffee or tears. Asterisk Rosa, I have changed the will. Javier needs the house for his children. You have no children, you never will. Daniel left and you chose this. You chose to care for me instead of living. I cannot reward a choice that was yours. I cannot leave everything to someone who sees me as a burden, even if you never say so. I see you, Rosa. I see you when you sigh lifting me. I see you when you look out the window during my exercises. I see the hatred you think you hide so well, and I cannot leave my legacy to someone who hates me. Javier does not hate me. Javier does not know me well enough to hate me. That is what a mother needs in her final days, not an excellent nurse, a daughter who does not hate me. Asterisk, I read the letter 100 times. Each word was a wound, precise and deliberate. I see the hatred. Hatred, it was exhaustion, it was pain. It was the certainty that every day I spent caring for this woman, my own life evaporated like water on hot stone. But hatred, I didn't know, I wasn't sure of anything anymore. I found something else in the box. Bank transfer receipts carefully organized spanning 12 years. Javier, during the entire time I had been caring for Alina, had received $2,000 monthly from her account. For the grandchildren, $288,000 in total. Money Alina had told me she didn't have to pay me a salary for my care. Money she had said went to medications, to special equipment, to the necessary expenses of her condition. Money that had gone to Javier while I changed her diapers, while I administered her morphine, while I lost my marriage and my career, and my capacity to feel anything other than the slow erosion of my own existence. I sat with the receipts for an hour. Then I called the bank. I verified the transfers. I called Javier. I confronted him not in a lawyer's office but in the house that was now his. The house where I had slept 12 years on a mattress, where I had developed a stoop and a cough and a permanent insomnia. I showed him the receipts. I showed him the letter. Javier didn't deny it. He couldn't. The evidence was too complete, too damning, too much like the financial documents he dealt with every day in his banking job. She told me it was for the children, he said, his voice small, the voice of a boy caught stealing from his mother's purse. I didn't know you weren't receiving anything. I didn't know she wasn't paying you. And if you had known, I asked. The question hung in the air between us, heavy as the lavender scent that still permeated everything. Javier didn't respond. That was the response. That was always the response. I didn't sue. It wasn't legal vengeance I wanted. It was something older, something deeper, something that understood the nature of houses and memories and the way that places absorb the suffering that occurs within their walls. I was a palliative care nurse. I knew how to kill a house. I knew that a house without proper care dies of abandonment, of neglect, of the slow decay that comes when no one loves it enough to maintain it. I knew that a house sold to strangers dies of dismemberment, its rooms partitioned, its history erased, its walls painted over the stains of lives that had been lived there. And I knew something else. The house's value was not in its structure, in its market price, in its square footage. The house's value was in its memories, in the layers of experience that had accumulated like the sediment of my own lost years. If I could destroy the memories, I could destroy the house's meaning. And if I could destroy the meaning, I could take from Javier what he had taken from me, the illusion that he had inherited something valuable, something earned, something that connected him to the mother he had never bothered to know. I invited him to say goodbye to the house. One last dinner, I said. A final moment to honor Alina, to share memories, to close this chapter with dignity. He accepted, relieved, eager to perform the role of grieving son that he had perfected at the funeral. I cooked Alina's food, the food she had hated in her final years. Boiled chicken without salt, so bland it tasted of nothing. Insipid mashed potatoes, thinned with water because she couldn't swallow thick textures. Steamed vegetables cooked until they were gray. The menu of her decline, of her dependence, of the slow stripping away of everything that had made food pleasurable. Javier ate, uncomfortable, making conversation about memories he didn't have. He talked about Alina's piano playing, which he had heard perhaps twice in his adult life. He talked about her strength, which he had never witnessed because he had never been present for her weakness. He talked about her love, which had always flowed toward him and around me, never touching, never warming. After dinner, I showed him the mattress. The mattress where I had slept for 3 years, where I had listened to her breathing, where I had held her hand during her hallucinations. The mattress that smelled of my sweat, my tears, my 12 years of service. I showed him the marks on the wall, the ones left by Alina's bed headboard when I moved it every 2 hours to prevent pressure sores. The marks that measured my nights in increments of 2 hours, that charted my sleep in fragments so small they couldn't be called rest. I showed him the bathroom, where I had learned to wash an adult body with the same care I had once given to infants in my nursing training. where I had held her as she wept with humiliation, as she raged against the loss of her dignity, as she cursed me for witnessing her vulnerability. I showed him the window, the one I had stared through every night, counting the hours until I could sleep, counting the days until she would die, counting the years until I could reclaim a life that I had already forgotten how to want. This is the house you inherited, I said. These are the memories that come with it. This is what your $288,000 bought you. Not a house, not an investment, not a connection to our mother. This, the mattress, the marks, the window, the 12 years you didn't live and I did. Javier left. He didn't sleep that night, according to Patricia, who called me the next morning to ask me to stop torturing him. I hung up. I had spent 12 years not sleeping. He could spend one. I didn't burn the house physically. That would have been arson, and I was not a criminal, and I understood the difference between justice and revenge even when the line between them felt thinner than a morphine syringe. I burned something more precious, the archive. Every photograph, every letter, every document, every piece of memorabilia that connected Alina to this place, that connected Javier to Alina, that connected any of us to a past that had never existed the way we pretended it had. I did it in the backyard, in a barbecue grill I bought for the purpose. I started with the photograph albums, the ones filled with Javier's childhood that she had kept so carefully. I watched the plastic covers melt, the images curl and blacken, the smiling faces disappear into smoke. Then the certificates, the awards, the documents that proved her love for him in ways she had never proven it for me. Javier arrived while it burned. He must have seen the smoke from the street, or perhaps Patricia had told him I seemed unstable. He ran into the backyard, shouting, waving his arms. "What are you doing? What are you doing? That's family history. That's our mother. That's everything." I fed another photograph to the flames. "It was my history," I said. "It was my 12 years, my mattress, my window, my marks on the wall, and you inherited it. You bought it with money you took while I worked. Now it's ash. Now it's smoke. Now it's exactly what it was worth to you while I was living it." He tried to stop me. He grabbed my arm. I looked at him with the same professional distance I had used with patients who became violent in their confusion, with the same calm that had allowed me to administer medication to screaming adults, with the same detachment that had carried me through 12 years of being invisible in my own home. "Let go," I said, and he did, because I was not his sister anymore. I was not anyone's sister. I was a woman who had learned to care for people who didn't love her, and that skill had made me capable of a coldness that frightened him more than any shouting could have. But there was something else. Before burning, I had scanned everything. I had saved digital copies, uploaded them to cloud storage, prepared them for distribution, and I sent them, anonymously, to Javier's children. To my nephews, who had never known me, who had grown up believing their grandmother was an elegant piano teacher who had died peacefully surrounded by love. Now they knew the truth. They knew she had left her caregiver with nothing. They knew she had paid their father while their aunt slept on a mattress. They knew she had written a letter of accusation instead of gratitude, a document that valued absence over presence, distance over devotion, the illusion of love over its difficult reality. The nephews, 116 and 114, confronted Javier. I heard about it from Patricia, who called to scream at me, to blame me for destroying their family, to accuse me of jealousy and bitterness and all the other words that people use when the truth becomes inconvenient. I listened. I didn't respond. I had spent 12 years listening to Alina without responding. I could manage an hour of Patricia. The family fractured. Javier's wife discovered the $288,000 and asked why she had never known about that money, why it had been hidden, what else had been hidden. Javier, trapped, said it was for emergencies, for the children's future, for expenses that had never materialized. His wife didn't believe him. It wasn't the money. It was the lie. It was always the lie. I opened a palliative care clinic. I called it The Last Door. It's small, it's modest, it's located in a converted storefront 3 blocks from the hospital where I once worked. It's for people who don't have family. For people who, like me, spent years caring for someone who didn't appreciate them, who lost themselves in service to others, who need a place where their care is valued rather than exploited. I hire former nurses, former caregivers, people who know what it means to give everything and receive nothing. We specialize in patients who have been abandoned, whose families have moved away, whose children have forgotten them. We give them what I gave Alina, but we do it with the knowledge that our care matters even when it isn't acknowledged, even when it isn't rewarded, even when it isn't loved. We have 12 beds. We are always full. we turn no one away for inability to pay. We operate on donations and the small inheritance I received from a patient who had no one else, a woman who left me her savings because I had held her hand while she died and whispered that she was not alone. The epilogue came years later. One of Javier's grandchildren, his daughter's daughter, sought me out. She was 22, studying nursing at the community college. She had found the digital files, the ones I had sent anonymously, the ones that had circulated through the family like a virus of truth. She wanted to know the full story. She wanted to understand why her great-aunt had disappeared, why her grandfather wouldn't speak of me, why there was a gap in the family history that no one would explain. I showed her the burned letter, which I keep in a safe in my office. Not the original, a copy. The original was ash with the rest. But I had scanned it before burning, and I had printed a copy for myself. A reminder of what I had survived, what I had chosen, what it had cost me. "Did you hate her?" the granddaughter asked. She was young, earnest, with the same desire to understand that I had once had, before understanding became too painful to pursue. I thought about the 12 years, the mattress, the window, the marks on the wall. I thought about the smile Elena gave Javier, the smile she never gave me. I thought about the letter, the accusation, the assumption that my exhaustion was hatred, that my pain was resentment, that my sacrifice was a choice she didn't need to honor because I had made it freely. "No," I said finally. "I hated that she hated me. That's different. I hated that she saw my exhaustion and called it hatred. I hated that she saw my pain and called it resentment. I hated that she took my love and twisted it into something ugly because she couldn't bear to acknowledge what it cost me. And that's what took me 12 years to learn. That her inability to love me wasn't my failure, it was hers. And I spent 12 years trying to earn something that she was incapable of giving, not because of who I was, but because of who she was." The granddaughter became a volunteer at the last door. She works weekends, helping with the patients, learning the skills I had developed over decades. It's not redemption. It's not forgiveness. It's continuity. It's the only way I have to say that the 12 years meant something, even if not to Elena, even if not to Javier. They meant something to me. They taught me that care is a choice, not an obligation. That love is an action, not a feeling. That suffering has no inherent meaning, but we can choose to give it meaning by using it to help others who suffer similarly. She asked me once, after working with a patient whose family never visited, whether I would do it again, whether I would choose to care for Elena if I knew what I know now. I thought about Daniel, about the children we never had, about the apartment with the nursery that remained full of boxes. I thought about my career, my colleagues, my friend Marisol who had stopped calling. I thought about the woman I had been at 29, the one who believed that love meant sacrifice, that care meant erasure, that being a good daughter meant becoming invisible. "No," I said, "I would not do it again. But I don't regret having done it, because it taught me what I will not do again, what I will not allow, what I will not accept. And that knowledge is worth more than the 12 years it cost me. That knowledge is what allows me to help others find boundaries where I found none, to find value where I found exploitation, to find themselves where I lost myself. If someone made you feel like your sacrifice was invisible, hear me. It wasn't invisible. It was seen and resented and used against you. And that doesn't make you a saint. It doesn't make you noble. It makes you human and wounded and real. And you can burn the memories and still keep what you learned from the fire. You can destroy the archive and still build something new from its ashes. You can choose, finally, to care for people who value your care, rather than people who demand it while despising you for giving it. That's my story. If it spoke to you, comment below. If you're still carrying someone who never thanked you, tell me. I'll read every word. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.